I will be making a recording of this. I have a podcast along with Ram Dass and Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg and a bunch of other people on the Be Here Now Network, BeHereNowNetwork.org. So I'm going to make a recording, and I promise you that if you say anything, it will not get onto the internet. I will sound edit everything out except what I say, so that what we're saying in this room, other than my lecture-y stuff, is going to be held in confidentiality. Before I begin recording, I'd just like to say that I'm the director of the Living Dying Project. Shiva said that briefly. We were the first organization, are the first organization in the United States, in the West actually, to promote conscious dying. Many years ago, Ram Dass, who I'm sure many of you know of, was friends with Aldous Huxley, who talked about conscious dying, but back in those days, this was an idea that the West was not ready for yet. And basically then Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came along. She started talking about dying. A dear friend, Stephen Levine, started working with Elizabeth. They parted ways amicably. And Stephen Levine and I and Ram Dass were living in Santa Cruz. And thus began the conscious dying movement in the West. Eventually, we decided to move somewhere where we could actually have a facility where we weren't just talking about this, but people could actually come and die consciously. We moved to Santa Fe. Instead of starting the center, Stephen got married. And Ram Dass, who was great at initiating things and not so super great at following through, decided to do something else, and there I was. So I started what was called the Dying Center, a very direct Zen-like name. And for 3.5 years in the mid-1980s, we had a facility in Santa Fe, New Mexico, at which 86 people came. Dying people, their family members. In the beginning, everybody that came got better and left. It was a very loving place. We fed people. It was free. So I was in the kind of bizarre situation that hoping somebody would die to validate my career. And eventually somebody did. So that was the good and the bad of it all rolled up into one. The Living Dying Project has trained volunteers in San Francisco, Marin, Sonoma, Alameda, and Contra Costa counties who offer free of charge, one-to-one support to people with life-threatening illnesses and those who support them. We have a website, livingdying.org, which is the most complete website on the internet that talks about conscious dying. And in January and February, I will be teaching 3 similar training workshops, one in San Francisco, which is going to be toward the end of February at the Women's Building in the Mission District. There will be one in Santa Rosa the end of January. The last weekend in January, then we skip 2 weeks. There'll be one in Santa Rosa. No, there'll be one in San Anselmo, and then we skip 2 weeks, and then there'll be one in San Francisco. I don't remember all the dates. But if you go to our website, right on the homepage, it says events. All that stuff is there. And I really also encourage you to go to the Be Here Now Network, BeHereNowNetwork.org. There's wonderful free podcasts, as I said, by Ram Dass, Krishna Das, Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, a lot of wonderful meditation teachers, including me. As well, I facilitate small ongoing groups. And there's one in San Francisco on Monday nights in the Mission, 6:30 to 8:30, maximum size of 9 people. It's filled up, but there's no waiting list. So if you were interested in any of those things, you could just contact our office, whose number or email is plastered all over the website and the newsletter. So now I will begin talking about our topic. And I would like to encourage people to make this as interactive as we can. This is not about something. This is a living experience. We're all adults here. I'm the person behind the microphone. If at any point you have a question, a comment, a complaint, just stand up and speak out. Are there microphones for the audience? I guess not. Yes? And you're taking care of that if somebody wants to talk? Okay, great. Did everybody get that? Any questions? Our topic this afternoon is conscious suicide. The Living Dying Project, as I mentioned in the introduction, is about conscious dying. And one might ask, what is conscious suicide? What is conscious dying? What is conscious living? Very often, when people are going through their lives, they're identified with a passing mind-body state. In English, we say, I am afraid. In Spanish, people say, yo tengo miedo, I have fear. In Tibetan, people say, fear is here. So just in the way we language, think about, talk about what we're feeling, what we're doing, it's very easy in English to get identified with what it is that's changing. Until people begin to do a more conscious exploration, it's so easy to identify with the trigger. So, for instance, it's a really hot day and you're feeling upset because it's so hot, you're blaming the weather. Or maybe you're a Democrat and you're blaming the Republicans. Maybe you're a Republican, you're blaming the Democrats. Maybe you live in Sonoma County and you're blaming PG&E. So that it's very easy to begin to fixate on the trigger rather than what it is that we are actually feeling. There is a healing process, a healing path that is the path that leads to conscious living, and it can lead to conscious dying and to conscious suicide. Let me just briefly talk about that path. The first thing is, can we experience something and not get lost in that trigger? Can we be mindful of what it is that we're feeling, letting go of the narrative? So if somebody cuts you off in traffic, can you let go of being angry at the person who did that and actually feel in your body what it feels like to be going through what you're going through right now? It, in a way, is talking about bringing meditation, contemplation, contemplative prayer into daily activity. And there have been all kinds of studies done showing that the more we cultivate mindfulness, a sense of well-being begins to increase. That's not too surprising, I wouldn't think. Other studies have shown that if we add heartfelt connection, that we're not just being mindful of things, but we're also having compassion, loving kindness for what it is that we're experiencing. Now we have to do two things. That greatly speeds up the movement into this sense of well-being. Somebody cuts you off in traffic, you let go of being mad at him or her, you feel directly in your body, what does this feel like? You let go of the story. What does it feel like to be angry? What does it feel like to be upset? And can I have compassion for the place in me that is getting upset right now? So certainly talking about a rather trivial example of getting cut off in traffic is nowhere near as difficult as the feelings people have when they are approaching death, when their loved one is dying, or when somebody is contemplating suicide. So if we don't believe that consciousness survives death, that when you're dead, that's it, that death is the period at the end of the sentence of your life, and then there's a black abyss, then what we're talking about today really doesn't make too much sense. What I'm assuming what this notion of conscious living, conscious dying, conscious suicide is about is that there is some assumption that there's some part of our consciousness that survives death. And whether we want to talk about reincarnation or heaven and hell or Shirley MacLaine or whatever worldview might happen to have, to me that's not so interesting, because that's what happens when the dying process is completed. I'm interested in what are the practical things we can do to be more awake right now. And the more awake we are now, that feeds into how we will die. And how we will die feeds into what happens after we die. Many of the world's contemplative religions say that the period of spiritual dying, not physical dying, but the spiritual dying process, which takes place over potentially an extended period of time. Physical dying, your brain stops functioning, your heart stops beating, you're dead. Takes a couple minutes at the most. The spiritual dying process sometimes begins days before the person physically dies, and it certainly continues after consciousness has left the body. I've been around so many people who've died, been at so many bedsides, and there is a process that is going on here. So that all of these contemplative traditions say that this period of spiritual dying is the most opportune time in an extended lifetime in which to awaken spiritually, to realize who we are. My friend Stephen Levine wrote a book, Who Dies? Very good question. The body dies, maybe the personality dies, but is there some part of consciousness that doesn't die? My first meditation teacher, Suzuki Roshi, founder here of the San Francisco Zen Center, said, the most important thing is finding the most important thing. So that's a kind of, on the surface of it, a light question or exploration, but what is the most important thing? If we really begin to ask that, what is the most important thing we can do or find? We're going to be in this room for roughly 1 hour together. We're all pretty much assuming that when the hour's up, we're going to walk out the door. What if you didn't know that you were going to survive this talk? In Buddhism, not that I'm going to bore you to death. No, not that. In Buddhism, there are things called the mind-turning truths. Truths that turn your mind toward awakening, towards studying the scriptures. And the first of these mind-turning truths is that you will die and you don't know when. There could probably be nothing more intellectually obvious than that. Roger Ebert, the film critic, when he was dying of a very difficult facial neck cancer, was typing out answers to interview questions, and he typed out, I don't know that I will be alive to type the period at the end of the sentence. So if we didn't know we were getting out of this room alive, how would it affect the way we were here together? How would it affect our motivation to be consciously living, consciously in this room? When someone is suicidal, they're almost always fixated on their suffering. And in Buddhism, and I'm not necessarily a Buddhist, but I like to talk Buddhist because it's, I think, such a clear, fresh language for most people. There is suffering and there are the causes of suffering. Cancer does not cause suffering. Resistance to having cancer causes suffering. Divorce does not cause suffering. Resistance to being divorced causes suffering. And almost always when somebody is working with having cancer in their body or going through a divorce, there will be suffering. But if we are saying, I'm suffering because I have cancer, rather than I'm suffering because I'm resisting what's going on in my life right now, it will be much, much harder to do the spiritual, emotional healing that is possible through this interaction with having this life-threatening illness. If we look around the room, we see older, younger, bigger, smaller, more hair, less hair, male, female, this color skin, that color skin. In that dimension, you will die and I will die. Is there a way we can look around the room and see that which is the same in each of us? Or maybe even more importantly, can we look inside of our own experience and notice that experience is changing moment to moment to moment. One moment, you're feeling your butt on the chair. The next moment, a thought passes through your mind. The next moment, an emotion arises. The next moment, you're hearing my voice. In fact, if you go to the movies or you're watching television, you can't hear the sound and see the picture at the same time. The brain is going very quickly back and forth between seeing and hearing, so quickly that it seems like it's a continuous thing. Everything is changing. Is there something that doesn't change moment to moment? If you're listening to the sound of my voice now, and most of your focus is on hearing the sound, what is it that continues when I stop? Is there a quality of beingness or consciousness or awakeness that's always there, that is so familiar that we don't even notice it, that maybe doesn't die? So my friend Stephen Levine had this wonderful quote: "Pain is mandatory, suffering is optional." Being in a human body will, at least at times, necessitate the feeling of pain. Emotional pain, physical pain. Again and again, pain will arise. Is it possible to feel pain and not get lost in suffering? Maybe for many of us, it's most easy in terms of physical pain rather than emotional pain, because physical pain is grosser, not as manipulative or seductive as emotional pain. Is it possible to be with physical pain and not suffer? Two people can go to the dentist and experience exactly the same dental procedure, and one of them is saying, "Oh my God, that's the worst thing I've felt in years," and the other one says, "Is it done? That wasn't so bad. I hardly felt that," because we confuse pain and some combination of pain and fear of pain. And what we're often reacting to is the fear of pain. So I facilitate this organization that encourages people to live and to die consciously, to approach death as wide awake with as open of a heart as possible. And what we're talking about today, is it possible even then to approach suicide in that way? That suppose you're in a body that there's a lot of pain, physical pain, you're not going to get better, it's very expensive for your family members to be taking care of you, you're in a facility, each day gets worse and worse. Is it possible to approach suicide in a ritualistic, conscious way, that instead of pushing away, I don't want to live anymore, I'm pushing away the pain, I'm pushing away the suffering, give me the drugs, give me whatever it is that I have to end my life, to do it in a way of opening to the next thing, opening in a welcoming way. And yet, you're doing this because you're in pain and you're probably suffering a lot. So that each time you experience emotional pain in your life and you unconsciously pull back resist that, that's going to make it a little harder to die consciously. Each time, on the other hand, you feel a difficult emotion, a difficult sensation, and you're able to open to it, feel it consciously, what's going on in your body, have compassion for it, you're beginning to create a new neural pathway that is going to make it a little easier to die consciously. In other words, each moment is practice for dying. This moment, if you're bored, if you're excited, when you are dying, it might be boring. It might be you've been in that bed for weeks and months. You've got drugs in your bloodstream. You can hardly pay attention. On the other hand, when you're dying, you might be in a car with the person that you love the most in the world, and that person is screaming in terror. When you are dying, you might be lying on the floor of Safeway, and strangers are ripping your shirt off and pounding on your chest and breathing in your mouth. So that we can't really count on the angels being at the bedside, playing their harps, playing their whatever songs they're coming up with, and that the dying is going to be a calm approach to the divine light that might be there at that point. So that even times when you're in a traffic jam, even times when you're feeling really sick. I had the worst cold of my life 2 weeks ago. For 2 weeks, I was coughing up green phlegm. I could hardly sleep at night. I was coughing all the time. I thought I broke a rib. It hurt so much in my side. And I was talking to one of my clients, and I said, I really like being sick. And he said, what? And I said, it really felt like I was in a different body. It wasn't Dale. It was like somebody else. It was reminding me that I'm not just this body, that there was something else going on that I really needed to pay attention to. We tend to get into a routine. You get up, you have the same cup of tea, you get in the same car, you drive the same place, and we can go to sleep in that habitual way of living. You get sick, and maybe that shakes you out of that ongoing way of doing the same thing again and again and again. So the idea of using dying as an opportunity for awakening rather than this horrible thing is, in a way, at the core of what we're talking about here. Is it possible that if we're talking about suicide or just dying from an illness, that it's an opportunity to really find out who we are? Going back to that Suzuki Roshi quote, the most important thing is finding the most important thing. What is the most important thing in your life? If the most important thing is trying to find happiness, then we're juggling, we're comparing each experience. Is it an experience that's going to lead to happiness or experience that's going to lead to not happiness? So that we're kind of one level removed from immediate, direct intimacy with experience. If, on the other hand, our motivation is not wanting happiness, but wanting truth, wanting freedom, then happiness will come as a wonderful side effect. But we're not grasping at happiness. We're finding a joy that transcends happiness and sadness. Is there a joy that transcends happiness and sadness, wellness and illness, even living and dying? That we're so awake that we're not caught in the content of what the experience is moment to moment to moment. Let me read a quote from Elie Wiesel. You are free to hold yourself back from the suffering world. This is something that you are free to do. But perhaps precisely this holding back is the only suffering that you might be able to avoid. That the great paradox of spiritual life is, to the extent we're pulling back from suffering, we're not awakening. That healing arises through leaning into the difficult, not trying to get away from it. That suffering, my old friend Ramdas said, suffering is grace. That's a lot to chew on. Suffering is grace. The place where you or I are suffering is exactly the place where we're resisting our lives. And that is exactly the place that's pointing us precisely to what we need to do to awaken. So that, suppose you have a friend who is suicidal. And I'm certainly here to say that I think people should have a right to do what they want to do with their lives. But that in physics, there's a law for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And that law seems to hold pretty much true in psychological terms. In Buddhism, it says that resistance causes suffering, which I was mentioning before. So every time we're pushing something away, we're causing more suffering. Let me give you an example, which is a two-part example. First part, I'm a mugger. I come up to you and I say, give me your money. You say no. I put a knife in your stomach and you die. Example number two, I'm a surgeon. You come to me and you say, I've got a pain in my stomach. And I say, well, I'm a surgeon. I think we should operate. And I put a scalpel in your stomach and something goes unexpectedly wrong and you die. The motivation of the mugger was greed, and the motivation of the surgeon was, that's a joke. The motivation of the surgeon was primarily healing, hopefully, not just making more money, so that the karma they accrue is very different. They did the same thing, the mugger and the surgeon. They both put a piece of steel in your stomach and you died. So what we're saying here is, can we begin to notice what motivation is? Are we trying to push away suffering? Are we acting out of greed, out of fear, out even of hope, rather than dying into each moment, dying into the love that is potential in each moment? So what I would like to do is slow down for a second and ask for comments or questions from the audience. Our friend with the microphone is back there. Here's somebody over here. Yeah. So what I'm saying here is, once again, going back to that Suzuki Roshi quote, what is the most important thing in your life? If it's comfort, if it's feeling good, then being sick is not going to be something that you're going to be liking. It's, oh my God, how can I get rid of this? And I do have to admit, I took all these Chinese herbs for a week. It didn't do any good, so I finally went to CVS and said, give me the strong stuff, and Mucinex and Tylenol and the whole thing, and that seemed to help a lot. And I'm not saying that if you're sick, you shouldn't go to the doctor and do everything you can to get better. What I am saying is that sickness or emotional distress, suicidal thought, your friend approaching end of life, whatever emotional, physical situation you find yourself in is an opportunity for awakening. Can you embrace with clear awareness and an open heart what it is that you are experiencing? And if you can do that, then, as I say, it's creating new neural pathways, going beyond all the conditioning that we experience from our society to distract ourselves, to not to feel happy all the time. I've got a teenage son, and 12 years ago, we were in Hawaii with his mother and her parents. The women were off shopping, so Grandpa and Dad and my son were waiting fairly patiently for the women to do their shopping. My son was at that point about 6 years old, and he was running around. He tripped and he scraped his knee on the cement, and he started howling like crazy. He was upset. He had fallen down and scraped his knee. He came running over to me, and he expected that I was going to comfort him to the extent that he was upset. And I looked at his knee and I said, Declan, it doesn't look so bad, you're okay. And he kind of was a little bit shocked, and he realized that he was okay. He was not bleeding, it was just a slight abrasion, but the shock had done that thing. And I'm not saying anything negative about his mother, but there is a tendency in our society that the more fuss you make about the pain you're in, the more comfort you get. So we're being conditioned to complain about pain so that we get comfort, right? So that not just physical pain, but emotional pain? And is it possible to work with, to be with, to meet in a very intimate, direct, loving way with difficult physical or emotional or mental experiences, to become conscious? So people go to meditation retreats. They sit quietly. There's pain in the body. There's pain in the mind. And that kind of controlled environment allows them to look at all the conditioning in the mind. But if somebody is now approaching the end of their life and there's a lot of pain and family members are gathered around and there's confusion, nobody's died in the family before, it's expensive, there's drugs involved, there's money involved, there's working with the insurance industry, the medical industry, it gets incredibly complicated. The mind can get overwhelmed by all of this stuff. Is it possible to keep coming back to the most important thing, to being awake, to being alive? Because our bodies are going to die, and because we're so preoccupied with, it seems like I'm over here and you're over there, and that these bodies are going to die, that right now it's hard to realize that we are awake. And in fact, all the contemplative traditions say that we are enlightened already. The New Testament says the kingdom of heaven is within you. In Buddhism and in Hinduism, they say that enlightenment is not finding something that isn't already here, but accepting, surrendering into what is already here right now, that we are enlightened right now. We're just so preoccupied with thinking that we're not. Okay, so that this the approach of death, or even to a much lesser extent being sick, allows us to start asking, what's actually going on here? Am I this body that is falling away? If you pinch your arm right now, you feel a sensation, which means that the body is an object. It's not the subject, because you're being aware of it. You can be aware of your mind. You can be aware of your emotions. They are objects. What is the subject? And being sick, as I say, can begin to shake up the strong conditioning that we think we are these objects. We identified so much with the body. I'm fat, I'm rich, I'm happy, so that right now, for instance, if Donald Trump came into the room, people would have a hard time seeing a human being. They'd identify, they'd project all of what they think about of, he's the president, he's this kind of president, he's that kind of president. Or on the other hand, if somebody were in the room here who was obviously dying, they were incredibly thin, their skin was gray, their breathing was really ragged, we would have a hard time, some of us, seeing the human being. We'd see, there is a dying person. Is it possible to go beyond those identities and be with what is beyond the identity? Which is a very important ability when you're guiding people who are dying or being a support person for somebody who might be contemplating suicide. Are there any questions about conscious suicide? There's somebody in the front, somebody in the back. Why don't you go with the back, and then you can be next. So the question was the concern about somebody who's in the vulnerable state of even contemplating suicide, or maybe being talked into it when they're in such a vulnerable state. And I'm not really here to talk about the political, legal, financial issues about suicide. Certainly there has to be great care in protecting people in these vulnerable states. I'm really, my specialty is more, can we use this time of great vulnerability as a time of having a deeper understanding of what's going on in our hearts? The Hasids have a saying, there is nothing more whole than a broken heart. So that, is it possible at the end of life, one could be so broken open by the fact you're going to be losing your body, your mind, all your stuff, all your friends? What is it that remains? What's going to be there after you've lost all those things? This state of almost complete vulnerability. Yes, that person does need to be protected, but at the same time, can it be an incredible opportunity so that we have this opportunity right now, possibly. The line I use to great effect these days is, when you are dying, Donald Trump will be at your bedside. Okay, but what I am saying is, any place in you that reacts to any notion you have of who our president is will be in you as you are dying. Any place where you automatically close when I say those two magic words is part of you. That's part of your unconscious. It's part of how you dream. It's part of how you relate to other people. And it's good to heal those things before we become that vulnerable that we're almost at the end of our lives. You could have an altar where there's Jesus and there's Buddha and there's Shiva and there's Donald Trump. I remember once I was giving a talk at the Northern California Psychiatric Association. There was a room full of theater seating in a hospital, hundreds of psychiatrists, if you can picture that. And this was a long time ago when George Bush the Younger was president. John Ashcroft was the Attorney General. And I said to these psychiatrists, you cannot have compassion for your client until you can have compassion for John Ashcroft. Half of them got it, and half of them started yelling at me. But the place in their hearts that automatically closes because they don't like John Ashcroft's policies is a place that's closed in their heart. If there's a place where I close to my anger, I'm going to not be able to be open-hearted to people who are really angry. If there's a place in me that is afraid or angry about Donald or whoever it might be, then that's a place in me that's caught. This does not mean that you don't protest, that you don't do everything as consciously as you can to bring lasting change in the world. But the people that have made the most lasting change are people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, who seem to do those things from an open heart rather than out of anger. So there's a question here in the front. I don't know if I said that. I said it'll be a lot more useful. I mean, the notion here is, how can we prepare to die well? And if you just believe that when you're dead, that's it. Certainly, dying as consciously and openly with as little resistance as possible is also to be called for. Somebody asked the Buddha, does reincarnation exist? And he said, well, if reincarnation existed, how would you live your life? And the fellow thought about it, and he said, well, because I would want a really good next birth. I would study the scriptures a lot, and I'd meditate a lot, and I'd be an all-around nice guy. And the Buddha said, okay, well, if this were the only lifetime, how would you live your life? And the guy thought about it some more and thought, well, since this is my only chance, I'd study the scriptures a lot and meditate a lot and be an all-around nice guy. And the Buddha said, just so, it doesn't make any difference. That what we're talking about here is being awake in this body, in this life, being as awake as we can. And I did say before, I think, that what happens after we die, I'm not too interested in. It's what practically can we do now to be as awake as we can, and what happens after that will take care of itself. But you do have a conscious choice in how you relate, how you respond to what's going on in your body. And to the extent that you relate to what's going on with fear, with resistance, it creates suffering. And to the extent, even if there's pain, even if there's deterioration, to the extent you open to that with mindfulness and compassion, you can then choose what to do with a greater wisdom than if you're reacting out of fear. First of all, I don't think awareness necessitates having a thought process, that it is beyond rational dualistic thought at times. Secondly, even if somebody is not sick, that there is that same process you're talking about, that at times one can be awake and at other times one is overwhelmed by emotion, by circumstance, by the environment, and then one comes back again. So that each moment, in my experience, and theoretically in terms of Hinduism and Buddhism and contemplative traditions, each moment is open to awareness. At times we get lost. And when you notice you're lost, then you get back on the horse again and ride off into your life. So that, admittedly, having really difficult symptomology going on in your body can make it more difficult to be present. But to the extent that you have been practicing of keep coming back, your motivation is to be awake, to be present, to be in your life as it's happening, then after a while, that separation from being present will be noticeable, and you'll come back and be awake with even that. So the trick is to not judge yourself, not getting into a superego attack to criticize yourself when you find that you're lost because of the intensity of what you're going through. Is it possible to be lost? And then when you notice that, when you notice the distracted mind, when you notice the lostness, can that be the inspiration to open your heart even a little bit more, rather than to come back with a jerk with saying you're a bad meditator, you're a bad cancer patient, you're a bad person, whatever identity you're going through at the time. My point is that a lot of people, when they notice they're caught, tend to come back with some self-recrimination.
Oh, because I'm not doing that.
Okay,
It's just,
wonderful.
Yeah, but thank you for that. It's sort of like, what is a deeper awareness? And I think that's an interesting question because I hadn't thought of it in a lot.
So we only have 10 more minutes. Let's see if other people have remarks or questions. A couple over on the other side. No. I've been around, I've had the blessing to be around some of the greatest meditation masters of the second part of the 20th century. And Tibetan Buddhist, Vipassana, Zen, Hindu, Jewish, Christian, Sufi. And certainly a lot of the traditional teachings are very anti-suicide, that suicide is like murder. You shouldn't do that. It's bad karma. You're a bad person if you kill yourself. But a lot of the more modern teachers say, no, suicide is just another thing. Can you do it as a ritual? Can you do it as openly and lovingly as possible, not in a reactive way? I was saying before this thing about for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. I gave the examples of the mugger and the surgeon. So is it possible to take your life, commit suicide without being reactive, to just feel now is the time to let go? I'm done struggling. I'm not doing this because I'm pushing away fear, but I'm opening to the next moment. And I haven't seen that really written about. I'm sure there are some teachers that have, but I'm not familiar with where you could find that. I'd be glad to talk to you about that if you wanted to call me up sometime. Sure. And somebody here on the aisle. In the beginning, as I was saying, people came and we were feeding them nutritious food, and they were living out in the country with loving people, and they got better and left. And it was called the Dying Center. I was saying, wait a minute. I mean, we were creating a model of a place for people could come and die consciously. And I mean, I'm saying this jokingly. I wasn't hoping somebody would die, but that eventually a lot of people died there. And so that I teach caregiving as spiritual practice. That, and just like we're talking over here about suicide as spiritual practice, as practice for awakening, can you take care of somebody, not in I'm helping them, but I'm doing this to awaken? Because to the extent you're fixated on helping the other person, you're going to be missing the signals in you that are showing you the places that you are caught. Whereas if you're doing this to awaken, you'll be the best helper. You're not fixated on the environment. There's some balance between the environment and how you're getting caught in the environment. And can you have compassion? So compassion is not a one-directional thing. It's not I'm having compassion for my loved one or my patient, but it's I'm in compassion. That includes me as well as the other person. And in Eastern traditions, compassion is almost always traditionally taught for compassion for the other person. It's assumed that if you're a practitioner, of course you have compassion for yourself. The Dalai Lama on his third visit to America said, now I'm beginning to understand, and it makes me very sad you Americans don't like yourselves. It's not so funny. So all of these Eastern practices were written by and for Asian people a few thousand years ago who were grounded, centered, walked around barefoot, didn't have an iPhone, didn't have an automobile, didn't pay taxes. They had a much simpler life. So it was assumed that you were somatically present, you were grounded, and you could begin this great project of disidentifying with ego structure and identifying with true nature. But in the West, if we have this neurotic beginning and we're trying to let go, it gets really messy pretty quickly for a lot of people, or maybe stale in some cases. One of my friends said you have to become somebody before you can become nobody. You have to have a rather healthy ego structure before you can let go of identification with that. So one more question, the lady with the dog on her chest in the back there. Oh, that's a really complicated question that we're at the end here. And people can end their life by stopping eating and drinking. And it's actually not a bad way to go at all. Once again, I've been around so many people who have died in a comatose state or in a demented state. And it was my impression that if they would have died suddenly, like of a brain aneurysm or a heart attack or an accident, and the discontinuity between being who they were and all of a sudden being dead would have made that transition much more difficult than if they had been demented for a few months or a few years. Now, I understand it's very difficult for the family members. It can be incredibly expensive and disruptive. But if we're just looking at it from the standpoint of consciousness, then that period of getting used to being out of control, being passive, receiving qualities that our society doesn't really promote very much, can be useful from the standpoint of consciousness. And I say that completely understanding how it can be an incredible disruption of a family structure. It can be expensive. It can cause a lot of suffering. But I'm not aware of anybody trying to change that. So one final question, our friend here in the green scarf. Does somebody have the email list that I sent around? You know, I don't think I'd call that natural suicide, but I mean,
No, I just missed it.
what is suicide? If somebody's really overweight, if somebody smokes, if somebody drinks too much, if somebody, everybody's on some spectrum of not taking care of themselves, of not valuing, I want to stay alive so I can serve the world or whatever. And I'm 77, I take my vitamins, I have a personal trainer, I drink wine, I won't even say the other things I do. So thank you all very much. Once again, we have a mailing list. If anybody would like to approach the Living Dying Project, we offer our services free of charge, almost all of them. I'll be here for a few minutes at the end of this thing if you want to come up and talk. And once again, in India, before the British showed up, there was no word for thank you. Because it was felt if somebody has something somebody else needed, of course it would go from here to there. But when you have to thank somebody, it creates a thanker and a thankee. It creates duality. And in spite of that, I'd like to say thank you very much. Okay.